All right, we're going to talk about the lateral ankle. And when we talk about the lateral ankle sprain, we're referring to the general ankle sprain. So when someone says they sprain their ankles, they're typically talking about these red ligaments here. And the one that we're going to focus in on is this anterior talofibular ligament. So the ligaments that we've talked about up to this point, the anatomy, we have the talus to the fibula, the calcaneus to the fibula, and then the calcaneus to the talus. So when we're looking at the anterior talofibular ligament, we have to recognize that it's the primary stabilizer when we're in plantar flexion. So when we're talking about how and why this is happening, the functional position of our foot when we are running is plantar flexion. So that makes us really unstable here, and it leaves the joint where the talus is very open and very susceptible to movement. And so when we're thinking of these movements in subtalar, we can go inversion, eversion, and then at the talocrural, plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. So when we're talking about running and we're in this plantar flexion position, other than the muscles providing some support, we're depending on this thin talofibular ligament here in the front. And so it usually cannot withstand, which is why we end up spraining our ankle. The other motion that is important to have to happen when this happens is inversion. So if we're running and we're just in plantar flexion, we usually have enough, it's usually stable enough just in neutral to be able to withstand that. But as soon as our foot slightly inverts, it widens this area here and puts too much stress on the anterior talofibular ligament. So that would be if someone stepped on a rock or a curb or another person's foot, or just sometimes, we just land awkwardly on the outside of our foot and kind of roll in. That is what we're talking about. Why does the CF and the PTFL not get injured as much? Well, that's because they're resisting in different motions. So the CF is resisting in just straight inversion, which is not a functional position when we think about it. Normally, if we're like flat, this fibula is providing enough lateral resistance that we're not usually going to turn in. And then for the PTFL, it's even more so that you would have to be in dorsiflexion and then be able to invert at the same time. And we're rarely ever doing that unless we're somehow tackled upon, like from the back. So someone comes and lands on you and forces you in this dorsiflex and maybe twist. If that's the case, we're actually worried about these blue ligaments for high ankle because it's just going to send the force straight up the lower leg. And that's the high ankle sprain. That's a totally different injury. So when we're thinking of lateral ankle sprain, this is what we're worried about. And as you can imagine, this happens a lot. And it's very easy to provide external stabilization to this injury with taping or bracing. So that's typically what we do. And we completely mask the fact that this ligament is injured. And all of our ligaments have receptors in them that communicate and send feedback back to the brain. And when they're injured, we have learned that these ligaments, these sensors, these receptors in the ligaments and muscles get muted. And we have to be able to get them back through rehab by doing balance exercises and things that make it unstable, in the joint, like on a foam pad, for example, and they're just one foot and they're moving all around. That's making these receptors wake up, and that provides signals back to the brain and opens up that communication. So that's a big thing of this injury that we have been ignoring for years, which is why we end up leading to chronic ankle instability, CAI, because if this ligament is not focused on and we don't do the neural part of that and also acknowledge that this ligament is injured and we shouldn't mask it with bracing and taping. We should in fact try to get the muscles back to be stronger, allow healing at this ligament, and also allow the neural network to start reconnecting. Then we actually just create more of an injury and an issue, and then over time we start getting so much instability here that it starts actually forming osteoarthritis. So it's a whole thing. There's lots of money put into solving this chronic ankle instability crisis that we have. So what you need to take away from this lecture is that lateral ankle sprains come from inversion mechanism, and the ATFL is the main one that gets injured, and that is plantar flexion with inversion, and that's because this is the primary stabilizer. This tiny ligament is the primary stabilizer in plantar flexion, so it's just too much to resist. So remember, plantar flexion and inversion, ATFL, that's your main lateral ankle sprain, and that's what we're worried about. If you have any questions about this and it's still muddy, please reach out.